por la palabra a Diana. Diana is going to chair it today. Thank you, Amy. I'm going to close my microphone.
Okay, thank you, Aurelia.
Gracias, Aurelia. Well, buenas tardes. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session of the Seminario de Investigadoras e Investigadores. We are very happy to have Amy Mullin from the University of Toronto in order to commemorate International Women's Day with the talk Dementia, Care, Respect, and Gratitude. Amy's work is focused on topics related to childhood, parental care, gender, and family. And actually, she has a book about pregnancy and childcare called Reconceiving Pregnancy and Childcare, Ethics, Experience, and Reproductive Labor. So welcome, Amy, and thank you so much for being here today with us.
Thank you so much, Claudia, and thank you everyone for joining us on International Women's Day. I'm just going to start sharing a PowerPoint, and I will start the slideshow from the current slide. Okay, can everyone see that? I guess
Yes.
it's taking up. Yeah, okay. So again, thank you so much for having me.
So we can see your notes as well.
Yeah, I don't actually have notes, so you can see them, but they aren't notes. You're just seeing what the next slide is. I don't see how to change that. Let me see what I can do right now. Are you still seeing the slide?
Yes.
Yeah, we have.
Yes? Okay. So again, thank you so much for having me. In my talk today, I'm going to be talking about feminist care theory, and I'm going to be arguing that it can provide guidance both for debates about healthcare decision-making for individuals with dementia and theorizing more broadly about caring relationships with them. So the overall point of my talk is to discuss healthcare decision-making for people with dementia. Then I outline 3 insights from feminist care theory, and then I try to apply them to the case of people with dementia. So I speak of feminist care theory rather than care ethics because I think that feminist care theory as a term is more inclusive of the political dimension of care. And I think that caring relationships should aim at what feminist theorist Robin Dillon calls care respect. And then I'm going to give some definitions. So by caring, I mean the activity of seeking to meet someone's basic needs, a caring attitude characterized by care respect, or both. And caring about is something that I'm going to be focusing on, and caring about is simply having something significantly and stably matter to a person over time. So I begin, and then I also thought I'm going to be beginning with a familiar debate about the medical treatment of people with dementia who were once fully autonomous but no longer are. So by autonomy, I'm referring to both the element of self-determination in which people understand their options and make decisions, and the element of authenticity in which people need to have relatively stable cares, values, and commitments that guide the decision-making. There is widespread agreement about the importance of respecting the self-regarding decisions of autonomous people, but there's much less agreement about the details of autonomy. So my own view is one of relational autonomy. That's probably not surprising. That's one of the most common feminist approaches. And I'm going to just give tiny details here, which I can talk about in the question and answer. So I take a weak substantive approach, by which I mean that I think there's no direct constraints on what you have to care about in order to be autonomous, but you do, in addition to having to have certain kinds of skills and capacities, you also have to have certain attitudes like hope and self-trust. I also think that critical reflection is usually useful for autonomy, although not always, but I don't think it's required. And as Claudia mentioned, I do some work on children, and I actually think that children have local autonomy in some domains. So it might be surprising that I'm actually going to say that I think that autonomy is not what we should be focusing upon so much when we're talking about people with dementia. Okay, so in talking about this familiar debate, I think ignores relationships of care that often predate the onset of dementia, but may begin only afterwards. So I'm going to start with it, and it's fitting, I think, that I'm talking about this debate because one of the major kind of figures in this debate published his book, Life's Dominion, 30 years ago this year. So this is Ronald Dworkin, and Ronald Dworkin, I also have a slide that describes what I mean by dementia. And I'll be talking about that kind of going forward. But now,
excuse me, Amy, we are seeing your slides, but in a small format. Can you
okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. I'll play from current slide. The only problem when I do this, I'm not able to see my talk. So let me see if I can. Nope, when I stop it. Okay, what I'll have to do, I guess, is I'll just won't go with my talk. I'll just go with the slides instead.
No, it's okay. Continue. It's okay.
It's okay.
Don't worry. Yeah, don't worry.
Okay. I'm sorry about this. That I thought it would work better with the two screens. So should I continue with the PowerPoint, or should I just sort of put it aside? What would you think? If they're just tiny little slides.
I think you can continue like this. It's okay.
Okay.
Don't worry about it.
Okay. So Ronald Dworkin argues that individuals experiencing what he calls serious dementia are no longer competent, and their treatment should be entirely determined by what would be consistent with their former competent personality. So his ideal is that people would write advance directives specifying how they should be treated should they develop dementia. And if they don't do that, then he thinks that the substitute decision makers should try to decide what their formerly competent personality would have wanted to have happened to them. He said that he believes that people he considers to be seriously demented is a very, very large group of the population. He thinks it's from 1/4 to 1/3 of all individuals over 80 years of age, he thinks have serious dementia or severe dementia. And then he goes on to, he says that people with severe dementia are conscious but not competent. He says they've lost all memories, all sense of self, and he does not observe that women are overrepresented in the population over 80. So he doesn't notice, even though most of the examples that he and other people talk about involve women with dementia. And he also doesn't note that women are overrepresented in those who provide both paid and unpaid care for people with dementia. So move on to the next slide, even though I'm sorry, you're only seeing tiny some thumbnail versions of them. So he does recognize that people with dementia might still be interpreted as having a desire to live and might still enjoy the satisfaction of having pleasant experiences, for instance. He terms those experiential interests. He says, a life without any kind of experiential interest, without any pleasant experiences would be impoverished. But for him, what makes human life distinctly valuable and which makes people deserving of full moral status is that they can have critical interests. Critical interests depend upon a person having goals, which make their lives better to satisfy and which they would be mistaken to fail to pursue. And so they have come with a standard of correctness. And he also thinks that critical interests require a person to have a perspective on their entire life. He says some examples of critical interests are close relationships and successful career contributions. And he argues that people with severe dementia no longer have these kinds of critical interests and are no longer capable of being in relationships. So as I mentioned, for Dworkin, only being with critical interests has full moral standing. And so people with severe dementia lack full moral standing. He also, there's a kind of a bit of a disconnect between what he says about people with severe dementia, like being kind of, conscious and incompetent, no memories and so forth, and the people he describes as having severe dementia. And one of the most famous is a patient named Margot. A medical student who spent considerable time with Margot, who had dementia, described her as one of the happiest people he knew. Margot enjoyed painting. Dworkin comments they weren't particularly great works of art, and that her paintings declined in skill over time. She enjoyed reading mysteries. Dworkin says that the medical student who visited her did notice that the bookmark would be placed at different places, suggesting maybe she wasn't always following the mystery very clearly. She definitely enjoyed eating favorite foods, spending time with her loved ones, and being held by them. So Margot is someone that Dworkin describes as severely demented. He says she no longer has any critical interest. She's no longer capable of having relationships. And the only way to respect Margot is to respect her precedent autonomy. Okay. So the view that the only way we can respect individuals with dementia is by respecting their previous autonomy. So when they were their previously competent selves is actually the received view in bioethics. Emily Walsh, just as recently as 2 or 3 years ago now, describes this as a received view. There are many contemporary examples of people with this view, including Cantor and Neil Grohl. And the implications for people with dementia, at least significant dementia, is to exclude them from being people with whom we could have interpersonal relationships. They are presented as objects of managing care, whose experiences should be as pleasant or lacking in pain as possible, unless perhaps they have an advance directive indicating that they should be not provided medical treatment or should be given euthanasia. So although Dworkin's view has been very influential, it certainly has faced criticism. Rebecca Dresser's work was kind of an article entirely titled Dworkin's kind of, theory, elegant theory, questionable practice, I believe was the title of the article. So she raised that in 1995, and she continues to object to his views about people with dementia. In her most recent article published last year on the topic, she suggests that people with dementia can care about maintaining previous relationships and starting new ones. Shanna Schifrin and Agnieszka Jaworska are other critics. I'm going to be moving on to talking very much about Jaworska. Dresser argues that people with dementia can continue to have not only relationships, but relatively stable preferences, concerns, and interests, and that their views should play a role in their medical care, even if they have to be interpreted and applied by other people. She also says that people who write advanced directives often fail to appreciate that their future selves, the selves who have developed dementia, can still have not only stable interests, but interests that are worthy of respect. Okay, so Dresser is one of only several people who furthermore use Laurie Paul's concept of transformative experiences as a way of saying that a person's interests can shift with dementia, and perhaps can shift so much that we can't really kind of like either attribute them to the same person, they're no longer the person that they were before dementia, or just that a person doesn't really have rational access to what their preferences would be like after they develop dementia. I don't think that, I think she's right that people's preferences can change a great deal, but Laurie Paul is specifically arguing that transformative experiences are such that the person is such a different person after they begin having that experience. Her examples are becoming a vampire, becoming pregnant, raising one's first child, that she says we don't have rational access to how our preferences and interests and attitudes could change. I actually think we do have some rational access to how our attitudes and preferences could change when we become pregnant and raise our first child, particularly if we've spent time already with other people who've been pregnant and raising children, if we've spent some time with children. But setting aside my kind of disagreements with Laurie Paul, what I would say is that I don't think the concept of transformative experience is really appropriate for dementia, because we do have information about ways in which preferences reliably change. For instance, one of the things that we know is that people with dementia often give much more weight to the value of their relationships than they did before. But in general, what I would be agreeing with Dresser is that we shouldn't discuss the importance and meaningfulness of new relationships and of new interests more broadly. So, and other people who talk about kind of the transformative experience in dementia include Versler and Emily Walsh. So, moving on now to Agnieszka Jaworska. She's probably the most sustained and kind of philosophically developed critique of Dworkin's views. And her view is that people with dementia can have continued partial autonomy. So she agrees with Dresser that a lot of people with dementia, at least in their earlier and middle stages, can continue to have interests that should be respected. She gives examples of people who are living in a kind of dementia care facility and outlines the ways in which they continue to have interests. She further argues, in a way that Dresser does not, that many people with moderate dementia can still have autonomy. Even if they don't value things in the sense of having a standard of correctness and a longer term perspective, they can still care about things. And she thinks as her view develops until kind of like she's continued publishing on this as recently as last year, their autonomy can be assisted. And you might think, if you know my work about children and autonomy, you might think, oh yes, so Amy Mullin is going to agree with this view. But I actually think that there's a problem with centering kind of our respect for people with dementia around the notion of autonomy. So let me just skip ahead. But I will say that Jaworska's view that people with dementia have continued partial autonomy is intended to kind of argue that they should still be recognized as having full moral status. I agree with that. The reason she thinks people with dementia can have full moral status is because they can still have authenticity. So the authenticity dimension of autonomy, they can have stable cares or values, and then other people can discover those stable cares or values and then use that to guide their care. It seems in some respects like this would be very much in keeping with feminist theories of relational autonomy. Our relationships with other people are crucial to our developing autonomy, sustaining it, recovering it. Also, they can threaten it. But Jaworska's concept of assisted autonomy stretches it quite far indeed, as she does recognize. Because for Jaworska, even if the person doesn't request help in a kind of achieving the things that they care about, even if they can't recognize that help is provided to help them achieve what they're caring about, a person is still assisting their autonomy if they help them achieve what they care about. So what I think is that because autonomy is about directing your life in accordance with what you care about, and people with dementia can lose memories, judgment, orientation, ability to pay attention, this can challenge very often their ability to direct their lives in keeping with what they care about. Sometimes it's still possible, but I think that even when it isn't still possible, it is really important and valuable to have other people help them shape their environment and relate to them in ways that reflect what the person with dementia cares about in the present. But I think tying the full moral status to autonomy makes it kind of more shaky ground. So I think rather than arguing that this is an instance of continued partial autonomy, I think we should tie the full moral status to the ability to continue to care about things and people. People can still be persons with whom respectful relationships are appropriate, even when they are no longer autonomous. And this is what I call the person's care view of people with dementia. So the person's care view of people with dementia is consistent with researchers' findings that when you interview people with dementia, they really want the care that they receive to reflect what they care about now, much more so than caregivers recognize. So I think that care for people with dementia should reflect what they care about now, even when they can no longer self-govern in central areas of their lives. When they can be autonomous with assistance, that is valuable. That is something that we should be trying to do. But instead, we should recognize that even when they can no longer self-govern, it's still really important to care for them in ways that are governed by recognition of their personhood and awareness of what they care about in the present. I also think that the contributions of caregivers to these relationships should not be overlooked. And it's really interesting because in these examples there's always in these examples of people with dementia, there are nurses or unpaid caregivers, daughters, mothers, paid care workers kind of lurking in the background, but you'll see that they don't tend to be fully named. So they'll just be unnamed nurses or Mrs. Rogoff and Fran, the housekeeper who helped with her care, or the daughter of somebody. So I think it's important to kind of bring these, bring the caregivers, both paid and unpaid, back into the picture when we're thinking about appropriate care for people with dementia. So my view is certainly closer to the view of continued partial autonomy than it is to the view of only precedent autonomy. But I think that caregivers should interact with people with dementia as people worthy of respect, and they shouldn't have the terms of their interaction and care provided or denied be dictated by the views of the person before they develop dementia. So again, I think that we should think about these like minor supporting characters in these frequently discussed cases of dementia, and think about what it would be like to sort of say, well, this person that you're caring for, you can't do this now because the person previously, when they were competent, said they didn't want this to happen to them. Or you have to do this because this is something that the person said they wanted to go on. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is turn to, since I'm saying I want to focus on care, I'm going to turn to some insights from feminist care theory. And so there's three. I think it's really important to reflect on both the ethical and political nature of relationships of care. And Daniel Engster and Joan Tronto are two examples of kind of care theorists who argue about the importance of thinking of care as not just about the ethics of interpersonal relationships, but of thinking more broadly about the political context. So we should be thinking about a fair distribution of the benefits and burdens associated with caring relationships, including how factors such as age, race, ethnicity, social class, and global location impact both who provides care and who receives care. Asha Bandri, in a recent book, develops what she calls an arrow of care, and it's a really nuanced account of how people's social locations inequitably shape both who gives care and who receives care. And as I've mentioned before, women are overrepresented, both as caregivers of people with dementia and as the people needing such care. Older adults of color in the United States are more likely to need assistance in their daily living than their white counterparts. And the direct care workforce, this is in the United States because this is where I had the most recent data, this is 1921. The direct care workforce in the United States is 86% female, 59% people of color, and over 1/4 were born outside of the United States. So I think that's really important, but and I think that's something I wanted to kind of bring to the fore. But what I'm going to be talking about a little bit more are two other insights from feminist care theory. So one that I think is really important is that the needs and capacities of both the caregivers, paid and unpaid, and the care receivers really need to be attended to. So we often focus on the need of the person who's receiving care and the capacity of the persons who are providing it, but we need to think about the vulnerability of providers of care, and we also need to think about the capacity of the receivers of care. So this is something that's very consistent with kind of like feminist care theory. Very early on, feminist care theory focused on the dangers of paternalism and the importance of paying attention to the needs and perspective of the care receiver. Then with the kind of work of Ryan, we need to think about the differential vulnerability of people who give and provide care in a global context. Eva Kate would be one example of kind of focusing on the social responsibility to provide people with heavy caregiving responsibilities, both with support for meeting their own needs and help in meeting the needs of the people in their care. So this is a kind of an important strand of feminist care theory. I'll just go on to my next slide here. And so this is something that I have focused on in some of my previous work, some work in 2011 about gratitude and caring labor. Monique Lenoir is another feminist theorist who has been writing about this. So for instance, a really wonderful article called Shades of Gray, From Caring to Uncaring Labor, that talks about paid care providers and how regimented their work is and how it makes it really difficult for them to receive the kind of have the kind of interpersonal relationship that makes their work often feel worthwhile to them. The idea that the best caring relationships involve care respect is one, again, kind of attributed to kind of Robin Dillon in an essay written just over 30 years ago. And what care respect involves is appreciating another person as this very specific individual and responding to them in their concrete particularity, recognizing that they have a perspective, seeking to understand the world from their point of view. For Dillon, care respect is a version of what Stephen Darwall talks about in terms of recognition respect that's due to persons because they are persons. And it's a really important point for Dillon is that autonomy is not required for care respect. So we can demonstrate care respect for people who don't have autonomy. So the third insight from feminist care theory is that selves are relational. So the capacities we develop and sustain are deeply influenced by relationships. This is, again, a familiar point for people who could kind of read about relational autonomy theory, but it's not just true of autonomy, but of our other kind of morally relevant capacities, including the capacity to actually be in a caring relationship. So the ability to be in a caring relationship, whether we're providing it, care, receiving it, or both, is morally important. Because it's morally important, this capacity should be developed, maintained, restored whenever possible. When I say that it's important to be in a caring relationship, it doesn't mean that I think it's morally valuable to be the passive recipient of care, that you don't appreciate as being provided by another person. Instead, what I think is important in kind of receiving care is the ability to value another person and recognize that they are providing one care. and to value them in providing it. So the care recipient is a value, and so meeting their needs is important. The care provider is a value, and so their caring efforts are worthy of appreciation. So now let me skip ahead to applying feminist care theory to relationships with people with dementia. So how do these insights relate to the debate that I began with? So the people providing care for individuals with dementia, whether they're unpaid family and friends or they are paid direct care workers, have the potential to be in a caring relationship with them. And this may be some of the very few remaining caring relationships available to people with dementia. So I think it's very important that caregivers are empowered to interact with the people with dementia as they currently are and seek to meet the needs of the people before them, rather than having the terms of care dictated by what the person previously valued. Whatever we might think about the prospect of Margot, who enjoys painting and spending time with loved ones and being held by them, having her life curtailed because of the views of her previously competent self, I think we also should think about the moral distress of care workers, including the paid care workers, helping her live that happy life. And I think that also not only should we care about that moral distress, but we should also recognize that paid caregivers and unpaid caregivers can really have insight into the nature of someone's current capacities. So I don't think that we can decide from the outside whether or not the person has the capacity to be in a relationship or not. So, okay, the next slide. So there is another factor to consider when we're talking about people who have caring relationships with people with dementia, and those caring relationships began before the onset of dementia. So this is typically going to be the case with people who are family and friends before the onset of dementia and are now taking on the role of caregivers. And it's normal to experience grief at the loss of the capacities of the person with dementia and the shifting nature of their relationship. So the things that you can't do with that person anymore, the things that they can't do for you anymore. And so your interaction is going to be understandably shaped by what the person was like before. But there's a way to do this, and there's a kind of more or less gracefully, let's say. And there's an example that Agnieszka Jaworska talks about a lot. And this is the example of a scientist named Julian and his wife, Anne. And Anne is the memoirist. So she's describing her life with Julian as he develops dementia and as she takes on increasing care burden for him. Julian is invited to a banquet to honor his scientific contributions. And Julian very much wants to give a speech at this banquet. But Anne is concerned that he's not capable of giving kind of sustained, articulate speech that's really easy to follow. So what she does is she talks to him over time, writes down what it is that she thinks it's important for him that he wants to convey. And then he wants to give a speech, but she gives the speech instead. And so... Sorry, I couldn't hear the question or the comment. No, okay. So in this case, I understand why why Anne would feel some discomfort of having Julian give a kind of garbled speech in front of his former colleagues. And I understand that when you're caring for someone with dementia and you knew who they were before, it can be really important to kind of also respect and kind of honor some of what they were like before. But I think it's also important to think about who they are now and what they care about now. So I wonder if what Anne was doing in this example was being a little bit more concerned, perhaps, it's hard to know, with kind of preserving the memory of what Julian was like before. And so I wonder if perhaps Julian could have given the speech and then Anne could have followed it up if necessary by conveying additional things that Julian had intended to say but didn't. And another option, because video recording, allowing people video recording of people with dementia and allowing them to edit a video recording is regarded as a really respectful way of kind of interacting with them and of helping them kind of come to understand or express the views that they want to share with others. And so I wonder now if perhaps, Anne could have worked with Julian to develop a video recording that would have been shown as well. And this is especially the case because we do know that care partners, like Anne was, often project their preferences onto the people with dementia that they're caring for. So this is a tricky case. I'm not saying, I'm sure that Anne was loving Julian in doing this, and it was a hard thing, but I just think that thinking about assisted autonomy, we should be thinking about what it was that Julian wanted to do. And it's pretty clear in this example that Julian wanted to give the speech, not just wanted to have his ideas conveyed to the audience from someone else. Okay, so this idea about what it's like for kind of to interact with someone who used to be kind of capable of things that they're no longer capable of, and how we can still strive to hold someone in personhood is an idea that's developed by another feminist theorist called Hilde Lindemann, formerly known as Hilde Lindemann Nelson. And Lindemann speaks, and I think it's probably her, but she speaks of a granddaughter painting her grandmother's nails red when the grandmother can no longer do so herself. And the father, the son of the woman with dementia, sitting and having his mother scratch his head the way that she did all her life. And these are examples, she says, of maintaining relationships, maintaining habits and activities that were meaningful to the person with dementia. But what I think is important here is that Lindemann suggests that these activities, like having red nails, was still important to the grandmother. And scratching the head of her son was still important to the grandmother. And so when we're trying to hold someone in personhood, I think it's really important that the way that we're trying to hold the person in personhood is still meaningful to the person with dementia. Because otherwise, I think the caregiver seeking to hold the person with dementia in personhood is locating that personhood entirely in the past. So if we're going to be kind of caring for that person respectfully, I think we need to be trying to do so in a way that's meaningful to them now, and not just something that would have meant something to the way that they were before. Françoise Baylis is another philosopher who details her relationship with her mother with dementia, and her mother, Gloria, insists, I'm still a person. She doesn't insist that she's still the home. She says, I'm still a person. I want to be treated still as a person. And so I think that there's ways of doing that that don't have to involve attempting to assist their autonomy. So James Wilkins is an example of someone who has an approach similar to mine, my kind of person's care approach. He has this, what he calls a narrative interest approach, where he says, so like me, he thinks we shouldn't just focus on what the person wanted before, either through an advance directive or kind of, a substitute decision maker trying to reconstruct their views. He also says we can do more than just think about, well, would any person want to have this kind of thing experience them? So he thinks that we can give weight to preferences, but the way that he thinks that this should happen is he thinks that the kind of care team and caregivers and the person themselves should try to be kind of reconstructing the story of a person's life. And so he says that we should think about plot and narrative structure and voice and characters. And what I think is that might work for some people, but I think that I'm concerned that thinking about the story of a person's life could kind of maybe overvalue narrative continuity. Not everyone has or wants to have a narrative of their life as a whole. And if there are ruptures, it seems like a narrative would want to try to fill them in and try to have a story about how the person is there's still continuity there. And I do think that sometimes the past matters a great deal to the person with dementia, but sometimes it's actually more important to them to focus on their current interests and what we need to do. And this is certainly I try to take away from my own relationships. I have one of the reasons I'm writing on this topic is because I have a number of people over the past decade that are in my life who are experiencing dementia. And I try to take my cues from the different people with dementia. And I know that, again, sometimes it's really important to kind of the past, but sometimes they want to a little bit be liberated from the past and not be held to the standards and values of kind of what they thought before. And so I think it's really important to try to focus on the present reality. And I do note that it's actually often more easier for people to do this when they're paid caregivers who've only come into the life of the person with dementia once they have already developed it. So I don't think we should kind of overvalue developing a story that coheres with the past. Sometimes that can be valuable for people, but it shouldn't just be something, it should still be something, a narrative that if you do develop a narrative that kind of resonates with the person now, and I think it's probably more important instead of focusing on kind of narrative continuity, just to think about kind of what is it the person values about the past, what is it that they value now. I also would say that my views are probably similar in some respects to Wasserman's and Navin's, who argue that we should continue to respect the stable patient preferences, even people without decision-making capacity, but they focus on avoiding coercion. I think it's valuable to avoid coercion, but I think we can do something broader than that by focusing on care respect. So let me just try to move the screen here. Move up to the next slide. So what is the upshot for healthcare decisions? Well, one very common kind of healthcare decision has to do with where should a person be discharged? So someone is in a hospital, they were previously cared at home with an unpaid caregiver. And a person's care approach would recommend a focus on the person's preferences now, but not just, but in light of their overall preference and values. So sometimes people will say something like, I just want to go home. And they often just want to go home, want to go someplace familiar, want things to be like the way that they were before. But they don't always appreciate, because of their kind of the loss of orientation and attention and so forth and memories, the broader context of that choice and kind of what it means both for their own health and what it means for their unpaid caregivers. So what I would think that we should be exploring is what is the value to them of maintaining their existing relationships? What is the value of having options for new ones? What is the value to them of the well-being of their unpaid caregivers? What is their tolerance of risk for serious health problems that might occur when their unpaid caregivers can't kind of care adequately for them at home? I think we should explore, are there options for assisted living facilities where paid caregivers are afforded time to meet their social needs, where activities that may be of interest to them are offered, where unpaid caregivers can contribute to care, where privately paid caregivers might be able to supplement the institutional care. And if there is a kind of a decision to kind of keep in-home care, are there good options for supports for that in-home care, for additional unpaid caregivers, for a daycare program, for respite, for paid caregivers to be employed? So I think that the prior views of the person with dementia can be relevant, but this is also not an entirely self-regarding decision, and they may not have a really accurate views of what they may not have been able to project accurately what their future needs and options might be. Okay, move up to the next slide. So care, respect, and the needs of care receivers. So I think it's really important in our relationships with kind of loved ones with dementia to be able to find ways to remind them of how they can still contribute to their relationships. So they can often still pay compliments, express gratitude, share hugs, listen to music together, make jokes, offer hospitality by means of items like an apple or a glass of water. One of the people in my life who has dementia wrote a poem last week about what it is like to kind of have a loss of memory, and it was moving and witty. And I suggested that she share it with other people, kind of recognizing the talents that she still has, the capacities that she still has. So I think it's really important to recognize that people with dementia, depending upon the stage of dementia, can often still make contributions, and that it often can be interested in doing that. And kind of recognizing that, I think, is an important part of care respect. Move on to the next slide. So paid care providers, I think it's really important that they have the opportunity to develop clear-headed insights into the needs and capacities of people in care. They often are the people who will most understand what is still capable. If time is made available to them, then they can pay close attention, which is required for care respect. And I think it's really important that paid caregivers should be given opportunity to interact with the people in their care as a person and not just a body needing management. So sometimes they can be told you have 4 minutes to give a bath, you have, 5 minutes to kind of get, to treat the person for bed sores, and it can be very regimented. Some people are still very skilled and they're able to still interact with the person, ask them questions while they're doing things, listen to what they're saying. But it's difficult to have a kind of really respectful, caring relationship when your work is extremely regimented. So also want to say that that care respect is not other focused, but it's person focused. And so both caregivers and care receivers are really entitled to it. And so it's important, as I mentioned, that caregivers should be given opportunity to relate to the person and their care as a person, not just for the care receiver, but for the value, for their own kind of sense of the worth of what it is that they're doing, and to recognize that what they are doing is not merely kind of caring for someone's body, but they're also in a social relationship. Now, Agnieszka Jaworska gives an example of Mrs. Rogoff, and as I said, the Fran, the person who doesn't get the last name. And Mrs. Rogoff once really cared and was an excellent cook. And now she would still like to contribute to making meals. And Jaworska suggests that Mrs. Rogoff, that Fran, the housekeeper, finds ways for her to do so. And she also gives an example of Mr. Gray, who was a kind of executive who was used to be able to kind of get a lot of self-esteem from helping others and kind of impacting the world. And that the nurses, again, unnamed nurses of Mr. Gray, find out that he's much more kind of cooperative with respect to his own care if the nurses ask him if he will help them do something. Can you help us now in drawing your blood, for instance? And Jaworska suggests that, and I think this is right, these are important contributions that the paid caregivers are doing, but also kind of suggests that these are like make-work projects, or like, isn't it like kind of cute that like, that Mr. Gray is more likely to be cooperative when you kind of ask him in this way. But I don't know if Mrs. Rogoff was still able to contribute to the kitchen or not. But what I do know is, as described, Mr. Gray was making the life of his caregivers easier. The role when they kind of came to him and asked him to contribute and to cooperate in his care, he made their life easier. And I think it's important to recognize when people who are receiving care are contributing as well. And so I think that that we need to focus a little bit more on the capacities of kind of people who are receiving care. And we need to look for ways of noticing and appreciating their contributions. Now, earlier I talked about statistics about the paid workforce in the United States. And what I really love about this report is that it also gives quotes from a lot of the paid care workers. And so I'm going to mention both of them now, and I'm going to talk about the quote from Felix Gubinele later. But Dessalene Watkins says, "My relationships with my residents are multifaceted. Yes, I'm their staff and my job is to support them, but I'm also a mentor, a friend, and I provide guidance. The residents are also here for us. If I come to work and I'm not in the best mood, they make me feel better and are concerned for me as well." So I think it's important that Ms. Watkins recognizes the capacities in those people that she's caring for and interacts with them as other people. And in a survey of hundreds of paid caregivers providing care to elderly residents in Australian care facilities, staff likewise indicate that they really appreciated learning from the seniors in their care and find value in their relationships with them. This is from my 2011 article on gratitude and caring labor. And I think that this is in keeping with kind of philosopher Jeanette Kennett's work when she argues that there should be a difference between our assessment of someone's current capacity for autonomy and the possibility of engaging in a social relationship with that person. And I think that's really important, is to recognize that even when someone can't be autonomous anymore, they can still interact with us as another person. Now, Dworkin argues that experiences of near total dependence reduces the value of a life. He says, particularly when a person doesn't recognize that they've received care and can't be grateful. Now, he holds Margot to be someone who's kind of incapable of experiencing gratitude. This would presumably apply to the grandmother described by Lindemann, Bayliss, and her interaction with her mother. But I think it's like, we shouldn't be too quick to conclude that people with dementia can't be grateful, and we should be open to evidence from the people who care for them. This is not to say that there are some people, some people that I love, who at the end of their lives were no longer capable of recognizing others, of speech, of having consistent and stable preferences. They were no longer capable of gratitude at that point. This was often shortly before death. But we don't want to be too quick to think that a person is there when they're still capable of painting and reading mysteries, even if it's out of order, and love being with the people that they've known all of their lives and being helped with them. And we should recognize that not only if she's one of the happiest people that some people know, she probably is grateful to others who are enabling her to live this kind of happy life. So I'm talking about gratitude, and I just thought I should say a little bit about what I mean by it. So for me, this is something I've written some articles on gratitude. And I think gratitude is a warranted response, not just to benevolence when someone gives us a benefit, that they're trying to benefit us, and not just a response even to someone who's providing us a benefit who wanted to benefit us, but also to someone who's respecting us. So if someone provides a benefit to us, wanted to help us, but they disrespect us, that for me doesn't merit gratitude. I also think that gratitude is merited even when motives are mixed, even when someone might be working for pay. So I think paid caregivers, is perfectly appropriate for us to be grateful to them, as long as they are not only doing it for pay, but also wanting to benefit people that they're caring for and are interacting with them in ways that are consistent with respect. But it's important, and Peter Ashley is an individual with dementia who wrote this article in 2014, This Is My Life, well into many years after having first developed dementia. And he talks about a friend of his being kind of encouraged by his wife to sort of say thank you. And he's like, you know what? He's perfectly capable of saying thank you if he feels gratitude, but we shouldn't expect people who are receiving care to be grateful, especially because sometimes they're not treated respectfully. And also because people have the right to just sort of be grumpy sometimes or to be having a bad day. So we definitely shouldn't be like making them say that they're grateful. It's just that when they are, we should be noticing that they are. Okay. And I'm getting near the end now. Now, if I go back to that quote from Kulix Vivanelli, another care worker quoted in Campbell's report, she says, "Our members appreciate the simple things we sometimes take for granted. When they tell me, thank you for the hug, or thank you for smiling, I know I did something right to help them happy, and that makes my day." So paid caregivers, I want to definitely acknowledge that there are very difficult aspects of their work. It's often underpaid. It receives insufficient social value. And just so I'm not saying that I'm not trying to romanticize their work. Instead, what I'm saying is, in addition to addressing these important aspects of their working conditions, we should also really be thinking, both for the sake of caregivers and the care providers, how can we enable the formation of caring relationships in which kind of, respectful care is provided and gratitude is warranted. Okay. So now I want to mention some opportunities to kind of learn kind of about and from people with dementia. So Dementia Friends is an initiative that tries to educate people who are studying to be health professionals about both the losses that people with dementia are experiencing and the capacities that they still have. And what's really interesting is that the people have studied this intervention, and they've shown that it really improves the attitude of the students towards people with dementia and leads them to develop plans to improve communication and promote their quality of life. So that's one thing, is that we can kind of like try to educate people about people with dementia, but also there's opportunities to learn from people with dementia. Al-Sawi and colleagues conduct research, as they say, with rather than on people with dementia. And they ask them, what do you value in your relationships with the people who are caring for you? And they value other people empowering their communication, emotional connection, shared laughter, feeling heard, not being dismissed, not being unheard, not being expected to follow a script. They describe things as, I know there's some right answer they're trying to get out of me, and they keep on asking me, expecting me to come up with the right answer. And that is not kind of empowering my communication. So the title of that article, by the way, that I'll solve is called, "It's Nice to Think Somebody's Listening to Me Instead of Saying, oh, shut up." So I think that all the people in their study experienced short-term memory loss. All of them had reduction in their ability to conduct the activities of daily life. Most experienced at least occasional disorientation and had some difficulty communicating. But all of them really appreciated still others empowering their ability to communicate. And I give examples of the ways in which they consider themselves to be empowered to be communicated with. What they didn't like is pretty much what most people don't like, right? Most people don't like being told to, oh, shut up, or being expected to give kind of the right answer and so forth. It's also important to know that studies of kind of the extent to which there's an article called "The Happy Dementia Patient?" And there are a number of people with dementia who report being quite happy, both those who are living at home and those who are living in institutional settings. There's also some who report being quite unhappy. But the things that make them happy, as Hugh Series reports, often doesn't have to do so much with their dementia or the degree of their dementia, but has to do with things like the nature of their relationships with the people who are providing care for them. And whether, if they're living in a care facility, if there are activities and offer that they're actually interested in doing. It's the degree of satisfaction often reflects just their personality and the reactions of other people around them, which is also consistent with work from Kitwood from kind of 25 years ago. So if there's one thing that I would want you to take away from my talk, it's kind of this next slide, which is that dementia is not a second childhood. I don't know if this is common in Mexico, but in Canada and the United States, very often elderly people, especially elderly people who need some assistance in the care, kind of in daily living, and elderly people who are experiencing dementia, people will talk about them as in their second childhood. Sometimes also caregivers might kind of talk to them as a baby and things like that. So there's an article by Kim Warcall. She's not an academic. She was giving advice to kind of caregivers of people with dementia. And this is a quote from that article, which was just published this year. She says, a person can quickly learn how to be a dementia-capable caregiver by applying what is already known from childcare, while always being mindful to never treat an adult like a child. This is hard, right? This is hard to kind of like take lessons from childcare. I do think there are a couple of lessons that we can take from childhood, from childcare, like that children can sometimes be confused if you use pronouns around them. So it's often easier to kind of use nouns. The people with dementia can sometimes likewise be confused by the use of pronouns. Children often need their attention called for. And sometimes people with dementia can find it really helpful if you kind of speak their name and wait for them to make eye contact with you. But it's also really important that people with dementia are adults and they recognize disrespect in a way that a toddler or baby might not. And they have relationships with people and they have histories. And so I think it's really important not to kind of think that people with dementia are in their second childhood and not to kind of lump them together. They're adult persons now whose lives have shaped their expectations as to what it means to interact with someone respectfully. So I urge you all to fight against kind of claiming that people are in their second childhood, even if they may have needs or may need some of the forms of care that children need. So I'm just getting down to the last two slides and my summary. So my summary is that I reject the only precedent autonomy view of people with dementia, both for healthcare treatment and for caring relationships. I do recognize that it's more controversial when it comes to healthcare treatment, but I think that if I can persuade people that it's applicable to kind of caring relationships, then I hope that that might be persuasive that maybe this is also a perspective we should be taking and thinking about healthcare treatment. I definitely prefer the continued partial autonomy view of someone like Agnieszka Jaworska to the only precedent autonomy view of someone like Dworkin. I think it's important to give weight to the present preferences of persons. I think it's more defensible, however, to adopt the person's care view informed by insights from feminist care theory about what's involved in care respect, attending to the needs and capacities of people both who give and receive care, and the role of relationships in sustaining personhood. And now, my last slide. I think there's a kind of a lovely quote from Dana Howard from an article published about 5 years ago. And she says, just because we have a presumption of respect for the self-regarding choices of autonomous people, should not imply that we disrespect the self-regarding choices of people who aren't autonomous. And their wishes can provide substantive guidance, even if we think it's not appropriate for them to provide authoritative guidance. So reactive attitudes more broadly are appropriate in interpersonal relationships. What would a person be grateful for? What would a person be resentful of? I think that's a way to kind of hold a person in personhood. And I think the relationships with and healthcare treatment of people with dementia can be informed by who the person was before onset, as long as it's still responsive to who they are now, along with insights from the caregivers who interact with them with care respect. So thank you very much. Sorry for the technical difficulties, and so that you just had these tiny little slots.
Thank you so much, Amy, for your talk. Very, very, very nice. Thank you so much. So are we getting to the Q&A questions? So please raise your hand with the option of the Zoom.
And if anyone needs
sorry.
Thanks, Amy. It's a wonderful talk, and well, as I told you in my email, I think it's a topic that touches a lot of people, especially I think my generation a lot because of the age of our parents and grandparents, and and so one thing I was kind of missing from your talk is this idea of a dignified life, of dignity. Because one of the arguments to implement coercive strategies may be that the person with dementia does not longer behave, in like the socially accepted forms. People find that they might be embarrassing themselves and embarrassing others. So the idea of imposing certain restrictions has to do with this idea of dignity, of And I was wondering if you also take this concept into your conception of caregiving and care receiving.
So what I do is, I read a lot of the literature on dignity, and I guess what I find is I find the concept of respect more guidance providing than the concept of dignity, because sometimes dignity is tied to kind of religious notions like dignity and that we have souls. That's some of the times that it kind of appears as in kind of language, and some of it is has to do with, as you said, sort of manner, and someone might be embarrassing themselves or embarrassing others, and I think it's difficult for people with dementia often to observe social conventions, to recognize that they apply. And so I think that you can expect them and kind of ask them to treat others respectfully. So there's a difference between being rude to people and kind of behaving in a way that someone finds embarrassing. So what I do is, for me, I find the concept of respect, both people who are capable of respecting others should still be doing that, even if they're vulnerable, even if they have needs. And also, we shouldn't be expecting people to kind of not embarrass at the point. We should instead be thinking about what is it that they're trying to achieve? What is the source of their frustration? And so for me, I find respect, which is a concept adjacent to dignity, a little bit more action guiding than kind of dignity. And there's some really interesting work done on what respectful care looks like in hospitals, for instance, and what disrespectful care looks like. One thing I noticed when I was taking some people I care about with dementia to get kind of COVID shots, there was another person there, and she was with her mother, and she turned to her, and the mother was asking her questions, and then she went, right, and which is like something that you would do to a child. And so I think that is an example. I understand she was doing something valuable. She was taking someone she loved for to get a COVID immunization, but even when a person may be rambling or maybe loud or forgetting what you said, I don't think you shush them like a child. I mean, I don't think that's even that helpful with children. So I guess I would say I think that the concept of respect I find more useful than the concept of dignity, which isn't to say, I know Sarah Clark-Miller has written about kind of dignity in a way that kind of informed by feminist ethics of care. That's interesting. So it's not to say that you couldn't do it. It's just I find this more helpful. I think Maria Jose.
Yes, thank you, Maria Jose. Thank you, Amy.
I can't hear you. Maybe you're muted. I'm sorry, I'm not hearing you. If you wanted to, you could type it into the chat.
No, no te oímos.
Mm-hmm.
I think she's going to
type it into the chat?
Yes.
Okay.
So while Maria Jose is writing, anyone else want to do a question? Marcia, please go ahead.
Yes, hello. Thank you, Amy, for your talk. It was really interesting. I want to ask you about the narrative continuity issue in your talk, because I'm a narrative defender. So I was thinking about Lindemann's work, and maybe not the one you quoted from 2002, but her more recent work of 2014, her book, when she expands this notion about holding identities with stories we tell for the people they cannot tell them for themselves. And she develops I think it's on that book. Now I'm confused, but I think it's on that book. She develops the idea that the different stories that form our identity have different heft, and the heft changes through time because we all change through time, our identities. So I think that maybe saying that there's no need to reassure the person that the person with dementia used to be, like you don't need to remind them every time who they used to be. Instead can be we can think about this problem instead as the heft of their stories has changed, because we all change through time. And maybe this respectful idea about not pointing them what they can't remember now could be developed in an argument about heft and respecting the person they are now, because that actually happens to all of us through life. Some stories that used to represent us years ago are not longer the most important stories that represent our identity. And I think because some of the past stories can still be important. So it's just about negotiating which stories should be taken care right now and which must be let go. No, that's the title of her book. So it's more like this negotiating with the person about how to hold them and how to letting go the person they are not longer.
Yeah, so the most important thing I think that you said is stories, right? And so that's what I agree with. So what I don't like is trying to get a narrative about their life that kind of stresses continuity. I think instead, and I said there's times when it's really important to reminisce, and there's times when it's important to share stories, including stories the person might have forgotten. And there's also a lot of times when you listen to stories that even you might have heard many times, right? So I think that there's a role for multiple stories and for kind of nuance with respect to which stories make sense now. And I'm not at all opposed to the kind of the role of stories. What I am opposed to is trying to kind of solve a healthcare decision by coming up with a unified narrative about the person's life as a whole. So I love narrative. I read, and a narrative continues to play an important role in the lives of a lot of people with dementia, including Margot, who was reading mystery novels, right? We still because reading narratives, we're engaging also with another person's perspective. And so that can be a way of kind of continuing to do that. What I just don't want is there to be one story that we're trying to create that creates unity for the person's life. I think that there can be disruptions. There can be times when one story, as you said, has more heft, times when a certain story shouldn't be, referred to or brought up. Multiplicity of stories, no problem with. I think they're valuable. One story as a way of kind of coming up with making healthcare decisions, I think is problematic.
Yes.
Now, should I look and see if Maria, if there's something? I don't see anything in the chat. Oh, yes, I was wondering, I do see it. If you can say more about your interest approach. At some point in your talk, you use interest, and I use interest and preference. Yes, okay. So I don't mean interest in the sense of objective interest, in the sense of what another person could attribute to them as an interest. When I talk about interest, I'm talking about just what a person is interested in. And so I'm talking much more about their preferences and the things that they care about. I don't mean to be referencing what might be held to be in their objective interest. But maybe you were asking about more than that.
You can hear me now?
I can hear you. I can hear you now. Yes.
Yes. So I just was wondering, if you can clarify this terminology that you use, like what you already did. Because it's at some point interests and preferences can enter into conflict, and it was only a clarificatory question, and it was just a small question. Thank you very much.
No, you're wrong. So sometimes I just got sick of saying the same thing, and so I would, but I only meant interest in the sense of what the person is interested in, and not in what they were objecting. And so I'll go back and look at my talk and make sure that that's clear. So that was helpful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria Jose, Marcia, and Amy. So we get a question from YouTube from Paola that says, thanks for the talk, Amy. Could you elaborate on how you understand the idea of full moral status? I understand that there is a great importance to be placed upon the care receiver's need, but how do we approach care receivers' moral responsibilities? For example, can we hold them responsible for abusive behavior towards caregivers?
Okay, so thank you. So I'll start by saying that in general, I think that just because a person has lesser capacities doesn't mean that they don't have any moral responsibilities. And so I've talked about this with respect to children. So children who are capable of it, I think that they have a responsibility to be grateful for kind of, care that was provided respectfully for them. I think they have an obligation to kind of be cooperative with respect to their care. And I would think, and even though I don't think that that the people with dementia are equivalent to people with care, what I would say is that even when a person is not capable of autonomy, they can still often have the capacities to react with another person respectfully. And sometimes the people with dementia can be very rude, that sometimes they can make racist remarks or sexist remarks. And I think that we don't just kind of let them off the hook if they don't know what they're saying, right? If they don't, then that's one thing, if they're delusional. But if a person, I think that it's appropriate to sort of say, this person is respectfully caring for you, and you should be treating them, most likely her, respectfully in return. So I do think that even people who don't have capacity for autonomy are capable often of behaving respectfully to other person and behaving disrespectfully, and it's appropriate to hold them to account. But then I think there was another part to the question. Oh yeah, full moral standing. So I think that someone who has the capacity to care has full moral standing, and someone who has the capacity to care is someone that we can hold responsible for kind of failing adequately to care. So if they're not capable of recognizing that they're interacting with another person, then they don't have that responsibility. But if someone does have the capacity to care, not only does full moral standing mean that they're entitled to respect and respect for their point of view, but it also means that we are entitled to expect certain kinds of moral behavior from them as well, and to support them in doing it and behaving morally.
Well, thank you so much. Efraín?
So, hi. Thank you for your talk. I found it very interesting. Having also experienced, dementia with relatives.
Mm-hmm.
So my question, I guess it's a clarificatory one, although it may be of another kind, and it concerns autonomy and paternalism.
Mm-hmm.
So just to be clear, you're not defending any sort of paternalism in your concept of care, right?
Okay, so paternalism is only appropriate as a concept when a person is autonomous, right?
Okay.
Right, because
yeah,
that's how you
precisely.
define. Yeah. So I am actually not defending paternalism. Whenever a person's autonomy can be assisted,
Okay.
I think it's really vital that you do that. I'm saying what happens when the person isn't capable of autonomy, and often like capacity is it depends upon the decision the person has to make or the choices they face. And so I don't know what the law is like. In Ontario, the law is that in order to make a decision about whether a person goes into a long-term care facility or not, you have to assess their capacity, and you don't assess their global capacity. You don't assess whether they can handle their own finances. You only assess this decision. Is this something that's in their ability? So when a particular decision is something that a person is capable of taking, even if they need reminders and notes and people to talk it through, then I don't think we should behave paternalistically. But we do have to behave paternalistically when a person is no longer capable of autonomy in a particular dimension of their lives. So, I have a power of attorney for some people who I love, and because they can't make certain decisions. And I've sort of said, you can still have the credit card and buy food and take yourself, but just don't respond to requests for money in the mail, right? So there's decisions that a person can make even within the financial realm, and there's other decisions that they can't. So I don't advocate paternalism, but I do think, like in my work on children and autonomy, I do think there's times when paternalism with children is completely justified, both because of their kind of interest and in order to help them develop their future autonomy. And then there's other times when I think that the child has local autonomy with respect to the domains of their life, and so it's not appropriate to behave paternalistically. And I think that's the same for kind of people who are temporarily might kind of lose abilities to kind of make autonomous decisions. When a person temporarily or for a long time or forever can't make it, then we have to, but that's not behaving paternalistically. When they are capable, we should evaluate them on a decision by decision basis, domain by domain basis. So I'm not sure if you wanted to ask something more about that.
Yeah, completely. So, because my worry was that autonomy and paternalism, I guess, also are gradual, right?
Yes, they are. So okay, there's a degree, yes.
Yeah.
So it's not just a question of that it's domain specific.
But there's a threshold, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so
that's my problem with the threshold, because it seems to me that in a way you're saying, well, who's gonna? Well, the problem is that there is like a space, like a void between autonomy and paternalism. And so when there's still some degree of autonomy, you can define that as you want. But there's some degree, at least one degree degree one of autonomy. So then you say, well, this is not paternalism is not justified in care.
So yeah. So
but there's a threshold where So that's my problem with the threshold and with autonomy and paternalism being matters of degree and not of all of nothing.
So I think that's the messiness of real life. And in real life, there are cases where someone can be, with appropriate supports, autonomous. And sometimes those appropriate supports will be available and sometimes they won't, right? So what people who are interacting with them, whether they're interacting with them informally and unpaid, or whether they're people who are appointed to kind of assess whether or not they're capable of making particular decisions, should do, I think it's important to make every effort to see if one can assist their autonomy. But if they are not capable of recognizing what their options are, right, of remembering what their options are, then what the most that you can do is try to respect authenticity. Right. And so authenticity and kind of figuring that they have stable preferences, like that's still important. That's part of what care respect is about, is saying you can have authenticity even when you don't have autonomy. But then we're not talking about autonomy anymore. Then we're talking about intervening paternalistically with the goal of trying to enhance kind of allow their authentically held preferences, their stable preferences, to play a role in their care and in their environment.
Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. It was a great question.
Thank you so much. So do we have any more questions? Martin?
There's a hand from,
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. I like your talk very much. I have just a remark that maybe is not in contradiction with anything you said. That's that I like the idea that, or to try in the interaction with people with dementia, to treat them as much as possible as normal people with autonomy and whose preferences have to be respected. But I think there's also a way of treating people with dementia in a way that you take them sort of very seriously, maybe, but you're really humiliating them in the course of doing that you let them, I don't know, go through some avenue in their reasoning and so on, until it really becomes clear that they are completely on the wrong track and that they are, I don't know, or to follow their wishes and say, okay, yeah, let's go and do this and that, and until they get into some completely absurd situation where they will be humiliated instead of perhaps being respected. So I think that there might be situations where it's important sort of to, I don't know, to guide, let's say, the interaction, the conversation with them in such a way as not to too much let them get into situations where they sort of have a brutal collision or something like that.
So I think that in a way you're following up on the last question, because you're sort of suggesting, so you that we might make mistakes, perhaps, or we could just fail to recognize when respect for autonomy is appropriate, and when instead what we might be trying to do is treat the person in a way consistent with their values and their preferences, right? And so, and it's not always, and the same person might be capable of making their own decisions even if sometimes a little bit unwise, right? But they're still capable of making their own decisions in some areas of their life and not in others. And so when the person can't foresee what the consequences might be of their actions, sometimes then I think it's appropriate to behave paternalistically, because they don't understand, like what they think they can achieve is not something that's achievable. And so, and I think when they don't understand what could be achievable, and when they don't understand what the consequences might be of their actions, and the consequences could be quite awful, not just to the bystander, but to the person themselves, then that is a time to intervene paternalistically and to try to kind of redirect them to options to try to think about what it is that they're trying to achieve and how that might be achievable. So I think that maybe the example of Julian and giving the speech might be the most relevant, like from my talk, where Anne decides to give the speech. And I can see like not wanting the person to be humiliated, but presumably people knew that Julian had dementia, and that Julian was no longer able to do the kind of scientific work that he was going to do before, and they were seeking to honor him and inviting him. So I do think it's important to that inviting body to say, Julian has dementia now. He would like to address you. It might not be entirely coherent, and I would love to follow up with some remarks that he mentioned to me that he might have, that he might not be able to convey. So, I think that there's ways of trying to enable the person to do what it is that they want to do. As I said, like maybe the video recording would be an option there, right? And so that you could play the video recording of Julian speaking, and Julian could be present. So I don't think that you want to be sort of saying, well, it's up to you. We're going to respect your personhood, and so you get to call the shots here. And so you can go outside in the snow in your hospital gown, right? Like, no, like there's times when the person doesn't kind of appreciate what their environment is. One of the things that you can lose with dementia is an awareness of orientation. And so when a person really isn't capable of foreseeing what the consequences of their action might be, I think it's appropriate to try to protect them from it. I think it's especially appropriate to try to protect them from from danger, from health problems. But there's also a danger. It can be appropriate to try to protect them from suffering. I don't think embarrassment is maybe enough, like mild embarrassment that the person might forget. But, a truly awful experience where others that they like to interact with are now going to be, loath to interact with them, that it can be worthy of protecting them from that. So I would just say that it probably has to be a little bit more than kind of something socially awkward might happen. And people, might think, wow, they've really gone downhill or something like that. Because I do think we want to, as much as possible, people who have the capacity to kind of do things, to kind of enable them to do things, to have social relationships still. But if it would actually undermine their goal of having a social relationship, because people would just be like utterly horrified, then you might want to kind of prevent them from going down that route. So I don't know. I mean, it's just, that's kind of a tricky judgment call. It's just, I'm not saying respect has to be respect for autonomy, and, and you don't offer kind of a person who doesn't know what the consequences might be any protection from the consequences of their choices when they don't know what they are.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Martin. So do we have any more questions? Aurelia, please.
Hi. I have another question, Amy. It has to do with the social and political dimension of dementia. I was reading an article I think last year, saying that as life expectancy grows, there's going to be a lot more people with dementia.
Yeah.
In the future, like in a few, I don't remember the number.
In 25 years, they say, pretty much. Yeah.
But the statistics were pretty high. And what the article was saying is that, I mean, it's normally treated as something that happens to specific individuals, and where the family have to find certain kind of solution for everyone to be as best as possible. But there are no more like public structures in place, so that it's actually taken into account that this is going to happen demographically, and that it's not something that should only concern individuals, but society as a whole. So yeah, please.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. So in general, I think whenever a person kind of needs care, it's really problematic just to leave it up to kind of private life and their family members to provide it. It's unfair for both because it can impose like really straight differential burdens on caregivers, right? And it's also unfair to the person who needs care because some of them are going to get it because their families are well resourced in terms of personnel and money, and some of them are not going to get it. So I think most kind of wealthier societies have some provision, right? So in Ontario, where I live, if a person wants to go into an assisted living, care, then that is publicly provided for. If a person is still able of living in their home, we will pay for personal care workers to spend time with them, to take them to appointments, to evaluate the safety of their home, to so there are resources. But as healthcare systems get strained, because this is usually put under healthcare, those resources can be put under pressure. So I think that it's not that there's no public kind of support for these things, it's that it's sort of inadequate level of public support. And especially I think that there is inadequate kind of bridge between the private and the public levels of support, right? So sometimes people can't care for their kind of the level of dementia anymore, but they still want to be able to spend time with them. But they might be placed in a care facility that's very far away. Sometimes they want to be able to come in and kind of provide food for the person, but they're told that no outside food is possible. Sometimes, so that's when I was talking about that example of where do you discharge the person kind of after the hospital stay. A lot of what I was saying was trying to sort of say, are there supports for the in-home care, kind of publicly provided and paid for supports for the in-home care, and there's the ability to integrate private care into the kind of public setting, because I think that's the most productive thing, is to sort of say, to what extent can these two things supplement each other? But it's very difficult. And if you're talking about, like, I went to an elder care seminar recently, and they're like, well, we can tell you about kind of, assisted living homes, but if you want to go into a retirement home, that's kind of like, then we don't really have information about that. And they're all different, and you're just going to have to call them all and find out if they have a waiting list, and find out what their policies are, and find out if they will allow two people to live together or not. Like, so right now there's a kind of a big gap in terms of kind of the bridging the public and the private provision of care. But it's going to be incredibly expensive. And one thing I do know is that there's a lot of evidence that people often prefer what's called like kind of daycare, which again, unfortunately, is the term, like it sounds like children, but where they go someplace for the day. And so we could think about in the same way that young people might go to school and go to daycare. Perhaps we can also have someplace where people can still live at home, but also have a place where they're picked up and taken someplace where they actually enjoy and have opportunity to interact with other people. And that means that their unpaid care providers also can still engage in paid work outside the home and things like that. So it's a big problem. And I guess what I would say is I do think there is some public provision in a lot of places, but there's not a very good bridge between the kind of the public and the private provision of care. But I don't know what the situation is like in Mexico, Canada, and the US and UK.
Can I ask you a very small question?
Sure. Yes, of course.
There was something you said during your talk that I'm very curious. I'm not surprised.
Sorry, I can't hear you right now. You're breaking up for me.
Yes, for me too.
Yeah, it froze, right?
Yeah, it froze. Yeah.
Yes. Can you repeat the question, please?
Yeah. No, that I'm not surprised that most caregivers are female. It has to do with a lot of the traditional division of labor that we are trying to make more equal. But I didn't know that women were also like most of the patients with dementia were also female. I was wondering if
they're overrepresented. But if you think about it, women live longer, right? And when does dementia occur? It's more likely to occur over the age of 80. There are more women living over the age of 80 than there are men. But also, so people of color are more likely to require care. I don't know if it's because they've received lesser qualities of care throughout their lifetime, but yeah, there's a lot of really interesting information about who receives dementia care.
Thank you, Amy.
Well, thank you so much. Anyone else have another question? If it's okay for me to ask a question, I was wondering about borderline cases. I mean, I was thinking on people with dementia in prisons, or people who has relatives like daughters or sons that don't want to care for her parents or their parents because they were abusive or something. Have you done some research on that topic?
So I haven't done research on the topic, but what I have written about what children owe their parents, and I think children who didn't receive respectful care from their parents do not owe a debt to them. So I don't think that anyone who was abused as a child owes a debt to now care for their elderly kind of parent with dementia. So I have written about that. In terms of I have not written anything about kind of people with dementia in prisons, but I guess what you're saying is they're in a prison because they have done something wrong. And so are they still entitled to some kind of care? And I guess, I mean, I think that people in prison, like the whole part of the idea about a prison is supposed to be that they're still supposed to be treated like a person, and we're not just sort of saying you've done something wrong, so now you know, if you can't work, then you know we don't value or we put an end to your life. So and of course, in a person with dementia will maybe no longer recall that they've done anything wrong either. And so I do think that for a person with dementia who has done something wrong, they're not entitled to any care from the people they've harmed, right? But they could be still entitled to like respectful treatment by the state that recognizes that their capacities have changed. But done no research about it, but those would be my initial thoughts.
Thank you so much. Anyone else? It seems like we don't have any more questions. So thank you so much, Amy, for giving this talk. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. So see you soon.
Yeah, and I just want to say that if anyone has any comments, anything that they think that I could do to improve my talk, to kind of, I would love to hear them. My email was at the beginning, and Aurelia has my email.
Thank you so much, Amy. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. This was my first time talking on this topic, so it was a really rewarding thing to have an opportunity to share my ideas with you.
Bravo! Congratulations. Thank you. So see you soon. Good afternoon.